Today I'm going to have a talk with Hamill. Pete is the author of the book Embodied Leadership. It's about the somatic approach to developing your leadership. I found it a really interesting read, and in the interview he will cover a few of the topics he describes in his book. And in the book he gives a lot of insights and a lot of practical tips and tools to develop your own leadership style. I hope you will enjoy the interview, and it will give you a lot of new insights like it has been given me.
Embodied leadership. What, in your opinion, is leadership?
Well, no, that is a debated concept. A widely debated concept. So let's start with a few things about what it's not, in my view. I don't think it's about a position. Because I think most people who I interact with in the world have seen people in positions of leadership, positions in the hierarchy where leadership is required, but have seen people in those positions and not lead. Therefore, that's not leadership. And actually, I mean, there's a real irony, which I've been kind of wrestling with and writing about a little bit recently, which is that when you're in a position of leadership, a position in the hierarchy, you have lots and lots of mechanisms of control. So you can compel people to do things. And actually, for me, leadership is about people wanting to follow you, as opposed to having to follow you because you set their pay in rations and you can be punitive and all of that sort of stuff. And so actually, being in a position of leadership and having all of those control mechanisms in some way acts against your ability to take genuine leadership, which is a real irony in terms of how we create organizations. But so for me, it's not about that. It's not just about a position. And I think if you go back to something as profound and wonderful as Gandhi, the movie of Gandhi's life, it starts off with, I think it's one of the American news networks filming his funeral, and the commentator is talking, and I won't remember it anywhere near exactly, but he talks about how here is this person who held no position of state, commanded no armies, etc., etc. All about what he didn't have, no nobility or whatever. Yet he freed a nation, led a nation to freedom, and the kings and queens and emperors of the world came to his funeral. And so, in that, and that example is a huge world example, but in that you see something quite profound of actually, really, leadership was never about a position for him. I mean, and it was based on something very fundamentally different. So if we see that, then we see that leadership and positions are two very different things. And so leadership is fundamentally about something that we are bringing forth as human beings, but it's also about a choice that we make. That piece of choice is quite fundamental to it. That it's a choice to lead, and that from my perspective, we all have that choice available to us.
In that way, I agree. It's if I hear it correctly, it's about values and putting your values into the world and take responsibility for those values.
That's a big part of it. That's a big part of it. For me, it starts fundamentally with, there's something, because it's a choice. If we start to see it as a choice, what we'll also see is that it's a risk. Because, if you look at the world leaders like Gandhi, a lot of them were killed. But, take it down to more prosaic kind of day-to-day organizational life. We don't kill people, but people are killed off politically. Or moved out of the organization or sidelined or whatever. So there's a risk associated with it. And, in organizational life, you will see the kind of, somebody starts to stand up and take some leadership or take some responsibility for something. And you will see the kind of conversation of, who does that person think they are? I think in the Netherlands you talk about tall poppy syndrome. So it's that kind of thing that you start to see arising. And, then leadership, we start to see it's a choice and it's a risk. So why would I take the risk? Really becomes the question, why would I? For me, that lies, kind of at the root of the values comment that you're talking about lies at the root of that, is what do I care about? Fundamentally, what do I care about enough to make that choice and take that risk?
Yeah.
What's important enough to me? And you go into, say for, most parents around their children will often take those kind of risk stands and take leadership at times. Someone tries to grab their kids from them, boom, they'll be there in a very particular kind of way to express a particular kind of commitment for their children.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something that's there for them. But if you think about, go back to the life of Gandhi, what he was a commitment to freedom for a nation, and he lived that commitment in a very particular way and in a non-violent way. And he was a commitment to both achieving the result and how it was achieved.
Yeah.
And so we see that his leadership was based around that commitment, and that was important enough for him to make that choice and take that risk.
Yeah.
And the question for leaders and organizations becomes, for me, what's important enough for you to take that risk and make that choice, step away from the mechanisms of control, and genuinely step out into a position of leadership where people follow you because they want to follow you, not because you can punish them in some way.
Yeah.
And that, I think, most organizational leaders really struggle with.
Yeah.
That I think is a tough challenge for most organizational leaders.
It is, because it asks a lot of responsibility and courage to do that. I just read the book. Yeah, I just read the book of Nelson Mandela, A Long Walk to Freedom, and I think it's a bit similar to the story you tell about Gandhi. He has been in prison for 27 years because he just stood for what he thought was important for his people, for the world.
Yeah.
And but that's a big price to pay. Yeah. Yeah.
It is, and one of the remarkable things about his story was how he inhabited his time in prison.
Yeah.
And that his time in prison was not dead time, and was not giving up or retreating, or he used his time in prison to further his cause.
Yeah.
And actually, by the time he was released, the very fact of him being in prison was furthering his cause.
Yeah.
Which is why he was released, which is a very interesting thing about how do we use the circumstances we're in to further the cause that we believe in.
Yeah.
And that to me is a real aspect of leadership, is that no matter what the situation, no matter what the challenges we're facing, we find a way to use that in service of what we're committed to and what we believe in.
Yeah.
I remember not long ago talking to a group of master's degree students and people in organizational development, and they mature students who are doing this degree as practitioners and hold senior positions in their organizations. And I was talking to them about this sense of a commitment in leadership, and one of the things that they were kind of they thought about it and they saw the value of it, but they were kind of going, is that too high a standard for the leaders in our organizations?
Really?
Which was really interesting. They were really concerned that this felt like too high a standard for leaders to have. And my point that I kind of brought back to them, and that's what I hold to, is, why should I follow anybody, genuinely follow anybody, without knowing what they're committed to and what they're trying to achieve?
Yeah.
Really? Why would I? You can compel me to do certain things because I'm in an organization and I have to follow some rules and I have to get my pay and whatever for a period of time before I get fed up and leave. You can do that to some degree, but that's not leadership.
No.
And, for me, what they were kind of saying was they were letting their leaders off the hook for genuinely leading. And if we see leadership in that sense, then I think, for everybody, there has to be a certain amount of humility of going, actually, that's difficult. Yeah. I mean, I don't say this is easy. This is difficult. It's a risky choice. It requires being really clear about what I care about, which for a lot of people is not where they've started from and is not what's clear and obvious to them as a starting point.
Yeah.
And then it requires being able to take a risk about making clear what I care about inside the organization, and learning how to do that in a way that politically allows me to further what I care about and lead the organization forward without necessarily being rejected and ejected from the organization.
Yeah.
And that's tough. That's not an easy thing to do, but that's genuine leadership. And the cynical side of me wonders sometimes whether organizations genuinely do want good good leaders, or whether they want good managers who they can control. Because I think good leaders are much harder to control, but actually, if you're really leading, then you're not trying to control them. So, that's the tension that I think most organizations really struggle with around this is, what does it really mean to have an organization with leaders within it?
Yeah.
And what would the impact of that really be?
Yeah.
Personally, I think the impact of it for organizations that I see where that happens and that leaders do start to express themselves are hugely positive and beneficial for the organization. But it requires letting go of some control, which is deeply scary for people. For all of us, hey, I'm as much of a control freak as anybody else. The letting go of control, of stepping into ambiguity, complexity, not knowing what's going to happen, trusting people and letting go, and not having it done your way and your vision and the way you want to see things is deeply scary because you're stepping into the unknown and the unpredictable. Now, my argument is that if you think you're not in the unknown and unpredictable, you're probably kidding yourself. So you may as well step into it in a way that accepts it and is much more effective. Because I think if you are engaging in a traditional approach of thinking that you can control and create and manipulate the future, then I think you're probably living in a bit of a myth. Hey, the bankers all had great strategy plans and great visions and great things stretching forward for 5-10 years plus prior to 2008. And hey, none of them had any of their banks going bust. None of them had the credit crunch in their plans. So, the reality of the world is that we don't live in a planned world where we can start to control it in that way. And therefore, if we accept the world we live in and we accept the complexity of the world that we live in, then actually the only sensible response is to start to give people the freedom to lead, to encourage them to lead, and to loosen those reins of control so that you're genuinely leading yourself.
Yeah.
And that's an ultimate paradox because we've grown up, many people, within a very rational, technical orientation to organizations where the organization is a machine, everybody's a cog in the machine, and it's about getting the cogs in the right place and fixing everything. But that metaphor for an organization breaks down in the world we're currently living in. If you look back at history, the things that have really changed or impacted things are probably things that were unpredictable. That we didn't predict, or not necessarily unpredictable, but that we didn't predict. It's 9/11, it's the credit crunch, it's the things that happened that weren't predicted that have actually really shaped and changed and developed things over the last number of years, and they're probably the most important things. And to respond to those adequately requires leadership rather than control.